Local productions seen on Delta College Public Media are made possible with support from viewers like you. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Mike Redford, and this is the Follow-Up. Welcome back. This is our opening show for Season 8. They thought it wouldn't last. To mark the occasion, I brought along my good friend, WSGW's Art Lewis. He is co-hosting tonight, as he has done, to open our new season of the Follow-Up each of the last 7 years. So, what do you say? Let's keep it rolling, huh? Coming up on tonight's show, the state of the economy, a hot-button election issue, of course. The Fed's cut the benchmark interest rate for the first time in 4 years, so what's the impact? The cost of most everything has been way too high, you know it, with inflation running rampant for far too long. What's the key to driving down those prices? Both major presidential candidates have different plans on how to address our economic issues. How different are they, and can this issue alone sway the election one way or another? We have two economic professors in studio with us as well to discuss it all, Dr. Chris Douglas from the University of Michigan Flint and Dr. Zachary Cohle from Saginaw Valley State University. But before we get to our discussion, we'd like to hear from you, our viewers, to help drive the discussion here on the show. You can join us on social media, you can email us, and you can dial into our follow-up hotline to voice your opinion or suggest future show topics. And if you'd like to watch any of our current Delta Public Media programming or past shows, you can log on to deltapublicmedia.org. Now for tonight's show. Thank you all for coming in. By all accounts, the economy is the #1 issue in the minds of a lot of voters this election. No surprise, last couple of years, inflation's been running way too high. The cost of housing, food, gas prices, you name it. Federal Reserve, last week or so, just cut its key interest rate 0.5 point, a larger cut than most analysts predicted. First time in 4 years they've cut anything. So what do you guys make of kind of what they did? Why didn't they dial it back maybe a 1/4 point? What's the impact, Chris?
Yeah, I'm a bit puzzled why the Federal Reserve cut rates, because inflation still isn't back down to the Federal Reserve's goal, which they call a target of 2%. It's at about 2.5%. But when the Federal Reserve cuts rates, that tends to cause inflation to go up. When the Federal Reserve raises interest rates, that tends to push inflation down. So it seemed to me this was a premature rate cut, since inflation still hasn't fallen back to where it was before COVID. And what was interesting was that the European Central Bank, which is the European counterpart to the Federal Reserve, they left rates unchanged. And usually the European Central Bank and the Federal Reserve kind of move in tandem.
Could you have lived with a 1/4%?
Maybe a little bit better than 0.5%. I could have really lived with 0%,
Yeah.
keeping rates unchanged, at least until we get back to 2%.
Some have said maybe they waited too long. I think some analysts were sort of hoping to see it a couple months before. They kind of waited, and maybe they said, oh gosh, it must do a 0.5 point. And we're probably going to see a couple more, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the Fed is responding optimistically to where the economy is at right now. I'm looking to purchase a home personally. I want to see even more cuts to interest rates. I want to get a better price on those homes. But inflation seems to be trending downwards, and I think the Fed is responding to a robust labor market where a lot of people have jobs if they want the jobs, and a steady decline in inflation coupled with a complete plateau of world prices on things like commodities, food prices. Everything's stable in the world right now, and that's good.
Stable with an increase.
So,
you know, I mean, when you look at inflation, yeah, it's down now to what it was, but it's cumulative. It's not deflation. It's just adding 2% to what's already there. It's not taking away from it.
yeah.
So when the consumer goes to the marketplace, they're still seeing all that old inflation.
Yeah, totally. And that is a terrifying thing if you're a consumer. Paying $4 for a baguette is ridiculous. The good news is we've actually seen increases in wage outpace inflation in the last 4 years. The average family has about an extra $1,400 in their bank account after you adjust for inflation. So the goal is to hopefully adjust the economy to the point that we still keep seeing wage increases as inflation starts going down and things just get better and better from here on out.
Yeah, we've got some graphics here to show our viewers. The inflation rate from 23 to 24, you can kind of see the numbers there. I think it's just short of 4% 10 years ago, and you can see sort of the steady decline from September to August. We've got a couple other things here from the Bureau of Labor Statistics that they can move the next pass through. The unemployment rate from 63 to 24, you can see that. The big spike in the 2020 COVID year because they had to increase wages to get folks to go back to work. And now it's sort of a lot lower, and it's not as high as a lot of people would think. It's a lot lower. And then we've got one more graphic there, the hourly wage change from the last 11 years, 2013 to 24. So you can see that spike again, and now it's sort of rebalancing itself. So as you guys sort of look at that, anything stick out to you at all?
Yeah, so inflation ran hot, of course, following the pandemic, and that was a real consequence of the very expansionary monetary and fiscal policy that happened during that time. You look at the money supply, which the Federal Reserve controls, and the money supply doubled between the pandemic and the aftermath of the pandemic. And that doubling of the money supply was really used to finance all that COVID stimulus, and that's just the textbook recipe for inflation. Inflation had been a problem for 40 years before that. The last time inflation was a problem was in the early 1980s when you had the oil shocks, and then Paul Volcker raised interest rates to break the back
There's
of
a
that
name for the
inflation.
past.
Right.
Jimmy Carter years.
Right.
And
So
that's
I
what cost him the election.
Sure.
Right. So I think people got complacent about inflation, kind of forgot where inflation comes from, forgot it could be a real problem. But the reason why inflation cost Carter the election is because inflation is a tax on everyone. It's a regressive tax. It hits the lowest income people the hardest because when housing prices rise, when food prices rise, clothing prices rise, or the price of everything rises, lower income people can't avoid paying those higher prices. And that's a very big hardship on them. Whereas if you're an upper income person, prices go up by 10%, well, who cares?
The other side of that too, in that slide that showed the job creation and that big spike where they weren't working and then coming down again, they've been touting all along all these jobs that have been created. Have they been created or have they been replaced? In all those job creations, the numbers we hear that, all right, we have this many more working now, were they just replacing jobs that had been lost during the pandemic where people were told to stay home and not work?
Yeah, I think economic variables in general, they're confusing. Like job creation, what does that mean? Unemployment is a really nice variable because it says exactly what it is. It's everyone who is looking for work, can they find work? And about 4% of the population right now that are looking for work cannot find it, essentially. It's job creation can be a little muddled. We are both creating new jobs and replacing old jobs.
The interesting thing about that too, when we talk about people looking for work that can't find it, it doesn't reflect those that aren't even looking.
Sure.
We went through a
Yes.
phase where there were a lot of people that weren't looking. The economy was in a terrible place, and how are they living?
So yeah, to your point, a lot of those jobs are what President Trump, I think, was calling bounce back jobs. Jobs are lost because people are told to stay at home, and then when they go back to work, those are counted as new jobs for the purposes of the Bureau of Labor
Yeah.
Statistics. So when the current administration puts out a bar graph that shows just this massive job creation, most of that is just people returning to work. But there has been new job growth on top of that because there is a record number of jobs in the economy right now, even compared to before the pandemic. But when you look at what voters are concerned about, the Gap organization has this poll that I really think is underappreciated. It's called the Most Pressing Problem poll. Every month, the Gap organization surveys a random sample of voters and says, what do you think the most important problem is? Unemployment is way down the list. Maybe 1 or 2% of voters say that. Number one is inflation, cost of living. Because again, inflation is a tax on everyone. The economy in general is up there. Poor leadership, quality of governance is up there. And then immigration is way up there too. By far, those are the 4 largest issues that voters say is a real problem. And I think that really, to me, suggests that the Harris campaign might have some trouble this November if people vote those pocketbook issues, which traditionally they do.
What was that famous line? It's the economy, stupid.
Right, yeah, Bill Clinton in 1992,
Yeah.
right. Right.
Well, let's go down that path between the two major candidates, former President Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris. Harris has said this over and over again, and it's really the same thing that her boss has said over and over again, we're going to make billionaires and large corporations pay their fair share, end quote. So what I think about is what is a fair share? I don't see a number. On top of, well, let me just finish and then go ahead. On top of that, a lot of the billionaires, larger corporations tend to provide jobs for a lot of folks. And if they're threatened with higher taxation, they might consider taking work overseas and sending those higher costs to the consumer. You got more on that?
Well, only that, you know, the notion that the fair share, we've heard about it for decades, and not one politician at any time in the history of that remark has ever put a number on it. What's the fair share? Yeah, I mean,
it's a total myth anyway that billionaires don't pay taxes. Something like
Well,
the top 1% of income earners pay about 40% of all income
Yeah.
taxes.
right.
I mean, it's
And-
just typical class warfare that plays well with a certain sliver of the electorate. The fact that it's not factual, it doesn't play any role in politics, of course.
Isn't that true?
And we're not here to take sides on either side.
Right.
I'm just throwing it out there. And then as far as Trump is concerned, he's talking about increasing tariffs, anywhere from 2 to maybe 20%, which I've heard, on imported goods from other countries and on American companies that take business operations overseas. I think he was talking about John Deere that was going to take some stuff over there and coming down hot on there. What are your thoughts on tariffs and what impact that might have?
We
Yeah.
turn now to the international economist.
Right, right.
Yeah, I could talk about tariffs. Sure. How long do we have the studio for? Another hour, 2 hours? This is the one bit of economic policy that worries me. I've looked at both of the proposals that the campaigns have put out. It's a lot of the same populist kind of, reaching to the extremes, but also at the same time, a lot of that stuff is over-promising and they're going to under-deliver, and I understand that. Donald Trump, if he becomes president again, can raise tariffs. He said he wants to raise it to 10%, 20%, a flat tariff rate across the board. Would be a disaster for the global economy, for the American economy. If you're looking at decreasing inflation, the last thing you want to do is put a tax on all of the goods that we buy. Everything that I'm wearing right now has been imported. All of that, the prices would go up 10%.
My shoes are made in America, but that's all right. But the thing about it is that part of the reasoning for tariffs is to try and drive business back to the United States to manufacture here.
Yeah, sure.
And in some ways, I mean, it sounds good, but it's a fallacy in a way.
It is shooting yourself in the foot.
The other side, we hear candidates constantly talk about, I'm going to lower taxes for this group, I'm going to raise taxes for this group. I'm sorry, Mr. President or Madam President, you can't do either of those.
Yep.
That's the purview of Congress. You can propose, you can talk to them, but even if you had a unified Congress and presidency, there's no guarantee they would go for it. We've seen that too.
The presidency does have power in terms of international tariffs, which is
Tariffs, yes.
troubling to me.
Yeah, but they can't raise taxes on U.S. citizens, for example.
Sure, but like Chris has been saying, inflation is a tax on us all. If a giant
Yeah.
tariff increase happens, that's going to cause a massive
Yeah.
tax to everyone.
Another problem too is you start talking about cutting taxes, that will just add to the national debt and the budget deficit. That's already running at $1.5 trillion, which is just beyond irresponsible for an economy that, for all intents and purposes, has full employment with the unemployment rate being at 4%. At some point, who's ever in the White House, either in the next term or some term down the road, is going to have to deal with the national debt and the budget deficit. You just can't be running $1.5 trillion budget deficits, as far as the eye can see, without inviting some sort of financial crisis or sovereign debt crisis. All it would take is for the bond market to wake up collectively one day and realize, well, the federal government has no ability to repay what it's borrowed, and stop loading the federal government money for the wheels to just completely fall off. Just interest costs alone on the national debt are over $1 trillion every single year. It's the largest line item in the federal budget behind Social Security.
Yeah.
The federal government right now is on track to spend far more on just making interest payments on the national debt compared to the defense budget. And those are things the federal government can't get around paying, because if you don't make interest payments to the bondholders, that triggers a default.
And in the real world that you and I live in, if our debts exceeded our worth, it would be called bankruptcy. Now, in the case of the U.S., from what I understand, the debt is now at about $1 123% of GDP, something like that.
Yeah, it's worse than
But
what it was
what-
during World War II.
But the saving grace that keeps us out of bankruptcy is all the land the government owns, because all that land has value. So all those national parks, all that wild land they have out west, even in the east, has value. So if that land's worth trillions, it still puts you in a plus column, even though it's not cash and you can't convert it right away. It has value, so they tell us we're not in bankruptcy because of it as a country.
Yeah, I mean, the government could conceivably pay off debt very quickly,
If it had to.
within a few years,
Right.
without even liquidating land. We have a robust economy. The American economy is so strong and insulated from a lot of the pressures that other economies are facing that, yeah, we are going to build revenue. And I would agree with Chris and say, yeah, maybe this isn't the time to be spending irresponsibly, though. Maybe we should scale back a little bit. I think the main problem with that, though, most Americans think we're in a recession right now. About 49% of Americans think we're in a recession. We're not in a recession. We haven't been in a recession since 2020. That is troubling. It is hard to sell austerity to a nation that thinks we are not doing economically well.
Well, isn't it interesting how easy it is to sell the fact that we're not doing well?
Yeah.
But again, we go back to where we started. People go to the grocery store. They look at the price. They'll believe you when you say we're not doing well, because they know when they go to the grocery store, they're paying that $4 baguette you talked about.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's why that consumer confidence is a bit down, particularly in that sort of, 35 to 54 age group, which these folks are in their prime earning years. And
I don't remember those years.
Okay, yeah, yeah, you and me both, brother. But back to the recession. It seems like we've been talking about that for 2 years. We're almost there, and then we kind of hold it off, and then the perception, as you said, is that, well, we're sort of going through a recession. And my question: so what sort of defines a recession? Number one, and secondly, are there any sort of historic signs from the last three, maybe, that we had? Would you say, Chris, when you and I talked on the phone, 2000, 2008, 2019, is there any sign that we're in something like that?
Yeah, so it's hard to believe that voters don't read economics textbooks, but apparently they don't, because they don't know the textbook definition of a recession, which is 2 consecutive quarters of declining gross domestic product production.
There you go,
by the goods
people.
and
You just heard it.
services.
So we're not in a recession.
Traditional definition of a recession. I think voters just use the term recession as a catch-all term to say that the economy in some form is not great. So sure, it's not a textbook definition of a recession, but the problem is inflation. Like we're talking about, it's a tax on everyone, especially lower income people. So if voters just kind of hear the word recession to mean economic problems, it just stands to reason that they say we're in a recession, even though it doesn't match what the textbook says. But yeah, I think another worry too is, like we're talking about on the phone, if you think about the last 3 recessions we've had, March 2020 with COVID, and then the financial crisis in 2008, and then 2001, those recessions happened without really any warning. You know, people went to bed Christmas, December 2007, thinking, 2008, hey, this looks like a pretty good year. 2007 was a pretty good year. Really, no one saw the wheels totally coming off in 2008. February 2020, when the unemployment rate is 3.5%, who would have guessed a month later the unemployment rate would be nearly 20%, and people would be staying at home at work.
But
So I
that
think-
circumstance was so different than all the rest.
Right, still, but it kind of fits that pattern of the economy just kind of falling off a cliff without
Yeah.
really any sort of advanced warning. 2001, people are super optimistic about the new millennium. Who would have guessed that?
9/11.
9/11, and then the accounting scandals plus higher oil prices led to a fairly minor recession, but it certainly wasn't what people thought that the new 2000s were going to bring. So I think people do see those kind of worrying signs out there: inflation, the national debt, the budget deficit, geopolitical things going on, Ukraine, Israel, Gaza, the Middle East. You just kind of think like, what's coming down the pike,
Yeah.
what's going to catch us by surprise.
Let me ask this. What does it mean to this country if the dollar is taken off the world standard and some other coin of the realm comes along and replaces the dollar in the oil markets or whatever markets you want?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think it is likely to happen. I know there was a big push by a lot of the BRICS, all of the developing countries that are emerging.
China, Russia.
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I think that wildly failed for the most part. The United States dollar tends to be the currency that everyone looks to, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. For that to suddenly disappear, oof, gosh, I don't know. Chris, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, and I think that's the one saving grace for the U.S. economy, and that how we can run these massive budget deficits without things really falling apart is that, the dollar still is king, because you talk about like the BRICS currency. Who wants to be paid in rubles, right? Who wants to be paid in South African currency? Who wants to be paid in whatever currency Brazil uses, right? Those are countries that have even bigger problems than the United States. So the dollar is kind of like in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king type of thing, because it's just hard to think, what would you switch to receive payment? And if you wouldn't take payment in rubles or any sort of BRICS currency, why would a multi-billion-dollar multinational corporation take payments in that? So I think that there's always this worry about the dollar, just because things just kind of look shaky in terms of inflation, the budget deficit, and the national debt. Traditionally, that has caused countries to run into currency problems. But still, the saving grace for the United States is every other country looks in worse shape.
Russia has 70% inflation right now. Like that's
Right.
being paid in the morning and not being able to spend your paycheck at night. Yeah, but yeah, like Chris said, I think the United States has weathered the storm for the most part of COVID and a lot of geopolitical tensions, and we are really good at paying back our debts. If you have a U.S. bond, you're going to get that paid back almost certainly.
So if you were in charge, how do you reduce that national? How do you cut into that debt that just keeps growing out of control? This freight train is coming right at us with some of the things that you talk about, the ramifications. What do you think they should do? And it's either side have a plan to kind of do that.
Yeah, I am in favor of a stronger tax rate for corporations. I think we are just down a little below where we should be at right now, at about 25%, I think. Lifting that up to about 28%, not a bad idea. Of course, it is going to slow down the economy a bit, but again, we're speeding up in the car right now.
Yeah.
So now's the time kind of to slow back down so that we don't overcharge, overheat, and land in another recession.
So do you believe in the saying that corporations don't pay taxes, people do?
Yeah, I mean.
Because if you raise their taxes, does that not add to inflation?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you are going to be adjusting things. But weirdly enough, I think Americans think the government is more impactful than they actually are. In a lot of ways, a lot of changing the tax code isn't really going to affect the larger macro economy. It's going to affect our daily lives a bit, but those larger things.
That's what's important to us.
Right.
Sure, absolutely. But I don't want to see giant, increases in inflation past what we already have. And an increase in tax rates, I guess would be pre-2016 levels. I want to go back towards that a bit, back when the economy was still doing really well. I think we're back in that phase. We have hit, the UBS Swedish bank recently said we are about to hit our roaring 20s again. We're taking off. The economy is doing really well in a lot of ways.
Well, in that case, I don't want to be here in 9 years when that comes to a screeching halt.
Sure. That is a great point.
We got a few minutes left. I want to talk the housing market a little bit. Zachary, you mentioned that a little. You like to get a house, and right now, I mean, getting down payments and housing prices are sort of through the roof, and the market's kind of soft. And then Vice President Harris on the campaign trail, this is another one of her stumping points, I guess, is touting a plan to give first-time home buyers $25,000 down payment to put that down and jumpstart it. Sounds good if you're a first-time home buyer, but won't that simply drive housing prices higher? And that'll also, it's more spending to add to the debt. And won't the market itself just sort of figure this out? Do we need that, or do you think that's just more sort of political posturing?
Yeah, I totally agree with all the things you said, which is why I think this is a terrible idea. When supply is constrained for housing, which it is, if you just give people money to spend, they'll just get reflected in a higher price. So if you have a house to sell and you know that your buyer has an extra $25,000 in their pocket, well, you just raise your prices by $25,000 to capture that. So it won't do anything to make housing more affordable, and it will just add to the national debt, like you said.
The problem is always at election time. Let's buy votes.
I was going to say, it's the oldest trick in the book, right? Just
it's the
write
oldest
checks
trick
for
in the
votes.
book, But the reality is, unless we figure out how to curb the deficit, we can't do anything about the debt, because the deficit is the contributor to the debt. So government has to learn to live within its means. Let me know when that happens. Don't know if I'll be around to see it, but really it's the only answer. How else do you get rid of the debt?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough because with the government spending over $1 trillion just making interest payments on the debt, that takes about 60 to 70% of all income taxes paid just to make those interest payments on the debt. Once you pay the defense budget, some discretionary spending, the government basically has to borrow to do everything else. Social Security, Medicare, basically everything but the military plus making interest payments on the national debt, the government has to borrow to be able to cover. So you just talk about that level of indebtedness. I don't really know how you dig yourself out of it, other than you just kind of hope that maybe over time you steadily cut spending, maybe you do some modest tax increases, although I think that'd be really hard to do in this political environment. Just kind of hope things, to quote Office Space, one of my all-time favorite movies, things just kind of work themselves out naturally. But there's no quick fix when you're $1.5 trillion in the hole every single year.
To bring that back to housing prices, I think things have not worked out naturally. So housing prices have been sticky for a bit. We've seen massive increases in terms of interest rates. You would imagine housing prices would come down a little bit to make that, to balance that out a little. That hasn't happened, and that's going to be an issue coming forward. I think the Trump campaign and the Harris campaign both put forward programs or possible solutions to that problem. I don't think any of those solutions are feasible.
The other problem with the housing concerns right now is, if we had 3% mortgage rates, for example, mom and pop who are empty nesters now and maybe don't need the house they're in would be more inclined to sell it and go buy something smaller. Now, a homeowner who's sitting there with a 3% mortgage isn't going to sell so they can turn around and get a 7% mortgage.
Yeah. We'll have to leave it at that, guys. Quick show, always fun. Dr. Zachary Cohle, Dr. Chris Douglas, always great having you on. My co-host, Art Lewis.
Pleasure.
We'll do it again this time next year. And that's our show for tonight, but be sure to join us again next week right here for the follow-up. Businesses are going to be facing sticker shock on benefits involving paid leave and an increase in the minimum wage, the result of a Michigan Supreme Court ruling. That's next week right here on the follow-up. And thanks for tuning in for our show, and stick around at 9 o'clock right here on Delta College Public Media. We will be simulcasting the vice presidential debate. That is at 9 o'clock. Thanks for joining us, everyone. We'll see you next week.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And make sure to click that bell icon to stay notified when we upload new content. Videos like this are only possible because of viewers like you. To help support this channel, click on the link in the description below. We'll see you next time.